an avid toy collector and comic book collector and some other geeky things. But do you know why? Um, well, for a few reasons actually. So I used to collect stuff even when I was little, like as an '80s baby. There was a lot of stuff marketed to us as kids, and we knew it was being like marketed to us. We just didn't care because the stuff was so cool. Um, the, the laws in the '80s were very lax under Reagan for how things could be advertised to children. So basically, our favorite cartoons were 25-minute commercials for the toys attached to those franchises, such as He-Man, Transformers, G.I. Joe, Mask, Centurions, all that sort of stuff, right? And like I said, I used to already collect stuff then because back then there were a lot of um, trade cards that people would buy. My favorite was Garbage Pail Kids, which has been brought back within the last, um, I don't know, 8 years or so. They've brought them back, but they're like retro. They're not the originals. The originals we all used to collect. Our parents used to hate them because they looked disgusting. But the fact that they were disgusting is what appealed to us so much. I think I started collecting them like in the third grade, before they finally got discontinued because the people, the company behind the Cabbage Patch Kids, Coleco, um, I think brought a lawsuit to keep the Garbage Pail Kids from printing more stuff based on obviously resemblance to the Cabbage Patch Kids. But not before they had a movie which is so horrible. I think is ranked as one of the worst films ever made. Go check it out if you dare. But also, I used to collect baseball cards as I got into like that so much. I even wanted to do Pee Wee baseball, which I don't know why I didn't join the Pee Wee baseball team. Maybe I was afraid to ask my parents, or I don't remember, but I wanted to do it, the Pee Wee Baseball League. But I used to collect all the baseball cards, and when I used to come back to Maryland during the summer to spend with my family, sometimes my grandmother would take me to flea markets because that's something she used to do on the weekends for fun. She would take me along with me, and I could find sometimes vintage baseball cards. But the highlight of my collection was when my father bought me rookie baseball cards for Bo Jackson. If you don't know about Bo Jackson, I don't know what to tell you. He played professionally in the major leagues and in the NFL before Deion Sanders. Um, like he had a whole thing. Bo knows this. Bo knows that. um, and I had the Ken Griffey Jr. rookie card, and one of my regular baseball cards. I think I had an error card. So if you don't know what that is, that means like they printed it with like an error in the person's name or stats or something like that, and that could be worth a lot of money. So I had one of those as well, but they ended up getting stolen. Unfortunately, a couple of my friends had broken into my room once and taken some stuff. I don't think they took my rookie cards. I think that later actually got stolen by my uncle when I moved back to Baltimore. We used to live in Illinois. Had a huge album of baseball cards. I even had a few basketball cards in it too, with like Michael Jordan and stuff like that. And somehow the whole album was lost, and so were my rookie cards. But I can't remember if my rookie cards were stolen by my so-called friends back in Illinois or by my uncle later, who was, had a drug habit. Let's say this is in the '90s. So after my album got stolen, I completely stopped collecting baseball cards because I didn't see the point in starting all over after I had been collecting for years as a kid, just to have it mysteriously taken. Go figure. But that was the start of my collecting. But as far as toys and stuff specifically, well, when we used to live in Chicago, I used to have a bunch of toys, as an '80s baby. as I mentioned before, Transformers, G.I. Joe, Legos, Star Wars, the original Star Wars from 77 to 85. Those are considered specifically vintage within the Star Wars fandom. Everything that was made from 77 to 85. And the G1 Transformers, the stuff that came out in the 80s before G2, the 90s, the original G.I. Joe, everything that was from 82 to 89. Like the stuff from 90 to 94 was still considered part of the original toy line for G.I. Joe, but most people my age and thereabout had stopped collecting after 89. Like the 90 to 94 stuff was horrible action figures for G.I. Joe. Very colorful, um, very corny looking characters, and it wasn't appealing anymore after 89. He-Man, same thing. They had the original Masters of the Universe line. Then they had a new one for a whole new cartoon with He-Man out of space. No one liked it. Um, had the original Legos when like the only like first like mini action figure for the Legos was the Spaceman, trying to get him now. And then they started going into the other stuff besides the space stuff when they started doing the medieval castles. But this is before they had all the franchises for all the different, I mean, the licensing for all the different franchises that you have now under Lego. And I had a bunch of other stuff that people haven't heard of, like insectoids, um, visionaries, and I can go on and on. The point is, all that stuff was left in Chicago. Like my stepfather and mother had a falling out, so we moved when I was in the eighth grade back to Maryland and never returned, and left uh, all of our stuff. Like the only thing I brought with me was my pet turtle, which didn't last long back in Baltimore because I didn't have anywhere to store him like I did in Chicago when I had my terrarium set up for him. Uh, I left a bunch of stuff, but like all my toys, I had a big toy box of stuff. All that stuff was left behind. The only toys I had in Baltimore was the stuff that I had in Baltimore that I would play with every summer. But by that time, I was already out of buying toys because I was 13. But I still wanted to keep a lot of that stuff. So I had a few things that I still have today, which I found later on in my grandmother's uh, house. Some stuff that she didn't toss away because she tossed away a lot of stuff too because she doesn't know the value of stuff. For instance, she threw away a bunch of classic jazz albums, which would be worth a lot of money now. I mean, records, like actual jazz records from the past. Like if you can think of like a famous jazz musician, it was probably my grandfather probably had it. She tossed all that stuff away because a lot of old people from the silent generation, don't know the value of stuff, which is why they're the best people to go to for flea markets and stuff because they'll be giving away treasures for very low cost because they don't know that this stuff is worth a lot, like those vintage Star Wars figures I just mentioned. But I did, manage to keep a few things. So um, one was this Mego Star Trek from the original motion picture. That's why they had this outfit on, not the regular one, because that was the one from that motion picture. But most people don't know that one. They know Star Trek from the movie part from Star Trek 2, like 2, 3, and 4 were a trilogy, which I actually have right here. But the first one was, yeah, it was good, but it was a little too, I don't know, heady for people. But at least I still kept this. My grandmother actually found this from a person she used to work for. She gave it to me. Then she also had my X-wing pilot Luke Skywalker, and Bubba Fett, not the one with, that shoots the missile. This one is glued into the back. But the original one that shoots the missile would be worth a lot, even if it's a loose figure. Still would be worth a lot. But those are the original figures, not the reproductions or repros like they say in the Star Wars fandom. And they're not like ones from Hong Kong or whatever, or like the Platico, the British version, which are all considered the genuine vintage figures, but they're not the ones that were originally released here in the US. Those are classic. I also had my old He-Man right here, and this Shira. That was my cousin's, actually, my female cousin. She got Shira, I got He-Man. But she it was left in my grandmother's place, so I wanted Shira, so I took that too from my grandmother's house. The That Lion-O is an original Lion-O, but that's not the one I bought as a kid. I bought that on eBay. So those were the original things I still had from my grandmother's house, as well as some wrestling action figures. I had the original WWF figures before it was called WWE, the big posable ones, not well, bendable ones, and I had some WCW wrestlers. Unfortunately, I'd have called myself giving that to my nephew who didn't want them, so my sister actually threw them away, which I wish she didn't. I wish she just gave them back to me because they would have been worth a lot. Like it was Hulk. One was Hulk. One was Andre the Giant. I don't remember who the WCW wrestlers were, but I could have kept them or sold those on eBay for a good amount of money. I also have like a vintage um, Batman bank from probably the 60s, and the one that came with the Batman cereal back in 1989. I got those from my other grandmother who passed away uh, about 8 years ago. She had like hundreds and hundreds of banks. So, because I'm a Batman fan, I asked her, could I have those? Of course, she gave those to me. But those are like the only thing I have left. Oh, no, I'm sorry. And I have, which I've shown before in other videos, my original Raphael Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle and this Hulk from like 19. I forgot, my wife actually dated it for me. I think it was 78, 79, something like that. Um, but those were the only things I had left from my toys because those were in Baltimore and not in Chicago. And the reason they were in Baltimore, not in Chicago, is because I didn't like them like that. They weren't my favorite figures, so I used to leave them here in Baltimore to play with. But I had a whole bunch of other stuff. There was like a Transor Z, which was based on an anime. Um, the original anime name was different than Transor Z, but in America they renamed it Transor Z. Some Voltron stuff, some other Star Wars stuff, some Japanese toys from lesser known anime. So those were here in Baltimore, but everything in Chicago was gone. So as an adult, I started recollecting these things again, especially once I started going to comic book conventions and I saw all these vintage toys that the vendors were selling. So I was like, oh, I want those. So I started collecting again. Been on eBay, Amazon. I bought a ton of those Batman Toy Biz 1989 figures, which I've showed in the past because they're cool. Um, like this. This is Toy Biz. This is Kenner. But yeah, so that's what made me a collector. It was just the joy of being a geek. Because once you hit your 30s and stuff, you don't really care what people think anymore, so you can do what you want. So I started doing that. Also, the comic books, because when I was a kid, the first comic book I think I used to read was Spider Ham. Spider Ham was like Spider Man in another universe, but he was a pig instead of a human, and his name was Peter Porker instead of Peter Parker. You may have seen him in this Spider Verse, the Spider Man Spider Verse movies. Spider Ham. He was in the first movie, but I don't think he was in the second movie. I forgot, but I like Spider Ham. That was like my first comic book. He and this dog. I think he was named Top Dog or something like that. He was like a rival to Heathcliff, the cat. But those were my first comic books. But those were like comics I would read and then like throw away. So I never had like comic books until like the '90s, and I was introduced to like Batman comic books by a friend in elementary school who let me read his graphic novel Death in the Family, which was when Jason Todd, the second Robin, was killed by the Joker. He beat him to death with a crowbar. After after Jason Todd has tried to save his mother, who had actually set him up to be killed by the Joker, despite that being a good Robin that he is, he protected her against a bomb blast, which is heroic as fuck. Like he gets basically beat to a pulp by the Joker, who says, "Just remember, this is going to hurt you more than it hurts me." This was not for kids. After that, he realized that the Joker had set a bomb in a building, so he never planned on any of them surviving. And Batman was on his way to try to rescue them, but he was too late because back then it was a decision made by DC Comics to let fans vote on whether Robin survives or not, and a lot more people voted for Robin to die than to survive because most people didn't like Jason Todd as a character. However, it came out many decades afterwards that that voting might have been rigged by someone who set it up to call repeatedly in favor of Jason Todd dying. That actually the fan base was very split on Jason Todd dying. That he actually the vote may have actually went to him not dying if this person or persons didn't rig the system to keep phoning in the votes for Jason Todd to die. But that's neither here nor there. Point is, it was a brutal graphic novel in my introduction into like real superhero comics, and so I later bought that. But the first graphic novel that I bought was actually Batman: Son of the Demon, which was him. It's now no longer considered canon, but it was the actual start of Damian Wayne, his Bruce Wayne's son, where Bruce Wayne ended up falling in love with Talia al Ghul, and Ra's al Ghul. Some call him Raz al Ghul. Some call him Ra's al Ghul. I mean, his name literally means son of the demon in Arabic. I mean, his name literally means the demon's head in Arabic. Ra, or the head, al Ghul, the demon. So, in any case, he set it up that they would fall in love because he wanted Batman to become the leader of his terrorist group, eco terrorism. The the what's the name of the shadow? I mean, no. What? Well, anyway, forgetting all that. So in the comic book, he became the leader of his group and was actually training them. He was actually training them to not be to not kill. And things happen, and Talia al Ghul realized that he could never be Batman as long as she was tied to him. So she lied and said that she miscarried because they had got married in the comic book. She, she lied and told him that she miscarried, and so they absolved the marriage, and he went back to Gotham. But in the very last comic book panel of the graphic novel, you saw a baby, and that was Damian Wayne. But they retconned it later on and made it so that Talia al Ghul and Batman just had a little tryst from which they had Damian Wayne, but that wasn't the original story. But that was my first graphic novel. And I remember later I had traded it with a friend for the Wolverine graphic novel, which was like the first graphic novel for Wolverine, his own solo story. Um, so I had to buy both of those later on, as well as Death in the Family. So that got me into my comic book collecting, both the single issues, the graphic novels, and the trade paperbacks. People have asked me a bunch of times what's the difference between single issue comics, trade paperbacks, and graphic novels. So sometimes, anytime you have a collection of comic book stories, sometimes they call them all graphic novels. But a graphic novel proper is usually a story that's not part of the, it's usually an entire story self contained within the book, the comic books, that's not a part of the monthly release of comic books. Is not, it's like a standalone story. That's usually what graphic novels used to mean. They were like standalone stories to the main story. Not that they were in the alternate universe. Usually they were, but they were standalone stories. Whereas the single issue comics came out every month, and you have trade paperbacks. There would be a collection of those single issue comics for like an entire year, or maybe just however long that mini series lasted. Those were the trade paperbacks. And for collectors, it's better to get the trade paperbacks because you can get the entire story in one book instead of buying the single issue comics. And it actually helps the comic book artists and writers because they actually make more money from the sales of the trade paperbacks than the single issue comics. And I'm all about helping the artists and writers because they get screwed so much by DC and Marvel. That's a different story. um, the single issues are good sometimes though when it's like a really iconic issue, like say the death of Superman, or the wedding of Superman and Lois, or the wedding of Reed Richards and Sue Richards from Fantastic Four, or the first appearance of some character, like the first appearance of Deadpool and the New Mutants, or the first appearance of the Black Panther and the Fantastic Four, stuff like that, right? Or the first issue of The Walking Dead back in 2003, which if you bought that issue back in 2003, then during the height of the Walking Dead craze, that single issue comic would have been worth like $75,000, right? Crazy. But so that got me into my comic book collecting. So I went to my first comic book convention in like 2014. Went crazy, going to all the vendors, seeing all the vintage toys, seeing all the older comic book stories, buying up those things. Um, and that got me in collecting, especially through eBay and Amazon, and just going to my local comic book store, which I always will support my local comic book store, as should you if you are into this geeky stuff too, because it keeps them alive. Like with a lot of people not reading the the physical prints anymore, it hurts their businesses. So you see a lot of them closing up. The only way they survive is a lot of them um, have turned into like franchises now, like Third Eye Comics here in Maryland. But yeah, so I've been buying all sorts of vintage stuff. But like I showed you my original stuff that I had left from the actual 80s, whereas everything else I have from the 80s now is stuff that I've bought on eBay and Amazon or in comic book conventions. So that was my trek into collecting, why I collect, because basically I'm making up for my nostalgia from being an 80s kid and losing all my toys when we moved from Chicago to Baltimore. Left everything, all my favorite toys. So there's still a few things on my list that I want to get. I've pretty much bought everything that I've had back then that I still want, because there's some stuff that I had back then that I don't want. But the things that I do want or did want, I have. But it's things that I wanted to buy as a kid that I didn't get. So that's makes a much larger contingent of my current collection, like Hot Rod and Bumblebee from Transformers, and the Power Master Optimus Prime, which was like the last Transformer I wanted before I got out of Transformers and they switched to the G2 Transformers, which sucked. Um, I have one more transformer I want to get, which is um Met, what's his name? Metro. He's basically the Autobot city. So I want him. But there's a few toys that I want that are made for adult collectors today, which are basically like made to look like some of the characters from the 80s. Like, since I have Power Master Optimus Prime, I want now this collector's Optimus Prime called Masterpiece, and there's different versions of him. So I won't go through all the little nerdy categories of Masterpiece Transformers or MPs or the Hasbro Pulse stuff. Some of the stuff you can buy in like Walmart and Target. So you'll see a lot of. So these guys aren't creeps. So if you see these adult men walking through Walmart and Target in the toy section, they are not creeps. They're just middle-aged guys who were 80s kids trying to, reclaim, you know, their 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 love of stuff from the 80s. They were marketed to them like me, and buying these toys up like the new GI Joes, which are like 6-inch figures now, as opposed to the 3.75-inch figures we used to buy as a kid. Um, so I got a few more of those I want to buy, but most of the stuff I bought, I've I've made up the majority of my collection. So if I don't buy anything else, I'm fine. But it's still a few things I want, and a few vehicles and play sets as well. Because I had a few play sets like Castle Grayskull from He-Man, or the playset for the um, insectoids. Yes, so they were. If you're asking me what insectoids are, they were basically these 6-inch action figures. They were like kind of a combination of human and insects, and they all came with like this little puppet like toy that was like their mascot or vehicle or whatever you want to call them, that you could put your hand in and animate them like a spider or a fly. And there was a huge playset that was part of that toy line. The toy line only lasted a year though, but for some reason I wanted those ugly action figures, which they've re-released 2 years ago under a new under a new toy line. But the originals, I don't know why I liked them. They were ugly, but that's where insectoids were. So anyway, that was a big long rant about why I love um vintage toys from the 80s, as well as the 70s and early 90s for Toy Biz, um, and the comic books, and why I still buy them today. Because, like I said, most guys from the 80s have a huge nostalgia from all the cartoons and toys marketed to us back then. Like, there's huge YouTube channels on that alone. Like, there's probably like 50 or so different channels on YouTube here just talking about nostalgia for toys from the 80s. So you can check those out. And I would mention them, but I can't think of the names right now, so I don't want to keep stuttering as I was, and I don't want to get too close because people keep complaining about my close shots. I don't mean to do that. All right, but if you got any questions about the toys I owned or own now or whatever, leave a comment, or if you collected some toys, let me know what your favorites were. Like, for right now, my favorites are still the Kenner Star Wars toy line, particularly the Jedi Knight, Luke Skywalker, and my Batman 1989 Toy Biz figure. Those are my favorites. But like I said, I have others like G.I. Joe and Transformers and He-Man and so many others. Stuff I still need to collect, and I'll show that in a future video. All right, that's it.